There are many ways powerful men fall. Some are dragged into courtrooms, some are carried out on stretchers, and some collapse in a way that never makes headlines but changes the balance of an entire underworld. This story begins with that third kind of fall: quiet, humiliating, and terrifying. The kind that doesn't need gunfire, because fear has already done the killing. By the early 1950s, Harlem did not whisper Bumpy Johnson's name anymore. It waited. People spoke it slowly, carefully, like a measurement of danger. Bumpy was not famous because he killed the most men. He was feared because he didn't need to. His reputation had grown into something larger than violence. It had become psychological. Predictable violence could be planned around. Bumpy could not. The man who would later confess understood this better than anyone. He was not a street thug or an impulsive shooter. He was a rival crime figure with years of survival behind him. He had outlasted wars, betrayals, and shifting alliances. He knew how power worked. He knew when to fight, when to bribe, and when to disappear. And yet, when he learned that Bumpy Johnson had marked him as a target, none of that experience mattered. At first, he didn't panic. Men like him never do. Panic is for amateurs. Instead, he did what had always worked before. He tightened security. He doubled guards. He moved locations constantly. He changed routines. He even arranged quiet meetings with intermediaries, hoping to feel the situation out from a distance. That was his first mistake. Distance meant nothing when it came to Bumpy Johnson, because Bumpy didn't hunt like others. He didn't rush. He didn't announce. He didn't send warnings that could be traced. He let the fear travel on its own. And it did. Within days, things began to shift in ways that couldn't be explained. People stopped returning calls. Trusted messengers suddenly became unavailable. Familiar faces started avoiding eye contact. Information dried up, but rumors multiplied. Everywhere the rival went, he felt watched, but never saw anyone. That uncertainty did more damage than an army ever could. This was Bumpy's real weapon, not the gun, not the knife, the waiting. The rival began to lose sleep, not because he thought Bumpy would kill him quickly, but because he knew Bumpy wouldn't. Stories circulated through Harlem and beyond. Stories about men who crossed Bumpy and lived long enough to regret it. Men who lost their power before they lost their lives. Men whose allies turned into liabilities. Men whose names became jokes before becoming obituaries. That was the terror. Death was clean. What came before it was not. As the days passed, the rival's confidence eroded. He started seeing patterns where none could be proven. Every delay felt intentional. Every silence felt strategic. He understood, at a deep level, that Bumpy was already in control, not of his body, but of his mind. That realization broke something fundamental inside him. The confession would later reveal that this was the moment everything changed. This was when survival instincts stopped pointing toward escape and started pointing towards surrender. Not surrender to the law, not surrender to enemies, but surrender to the idea that some fates were worse than dying. He knew Bumpy's style. He knew that if Bumpy wanted him dead, he would already be dead. The fact that he wasn't meant something else was coming. Something slower, something designed to strip him layer by layer until nothing recognizable remained. Power in the underworld depends on perception. Once people believe you are finished, you are. And Bumpy understood that better than anyone. He didn't need to destroy a man physically if he could dismantle him socially, financially, and psychologically first. The rival could feel that dismantling begin, piece by piece. His empire started to crack. Small cracks at first. A missed shipment, a deal that fell apart without explanation, a sudden shortage of loyalty. These were not coincidences, they were messages. And each message said the same thing. Bumpy was close. That closeness became unbearable. The rival began to understand that even if he survived, he would never escape the shadow that was now following him. Even if Bumpy spared his life, the fear would never leave. He would always wonder when the next move would come, when the next humiliation would arrive, when the final step would be taken. That is when the unthinkable thought appeared. Not how to escape, not how to fight back, but how to end it. According to his later confession, The moment he begged for death was not weakness. It was clarity. He realized that execution was the only outcome he could understand, the only end that still allowed a sense of control. Facing Bumpy's wrath meant living without dignity, without certainty, without power. Death, by comparison, felt merciful. This is what separated Bumpy Johnson from every other figure of his time. He didn't just threaten lives, he threatened identity. He made men question who they were before he ever touched them. And once that question took root, the outcome was inevitable. By the time intermediaries carried the message that the rival would rather die than face what was coming, the damage was already done. The confession wasn't just about fear. It was about respect, twisted into terror. It was about understanding that some reputations become prisons for those who stand against them. And Harlem watched closely. Because if a man powerful enough to command armies could be reduced to begging for death without a single shot fired, then Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a gangster. He was something else entirely. And this was only the beginning of what his enemies were about to learn. Fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, like water through cracks in concrete, unnoticed until the structure was already weakened. After the rival's confession began circulating in whispers, the underworld tried to explain it away. Men told themselves it was exaggeration, stress, bad nerves. Powerful figures do not beg. They negotiate. They fight. They flee. That is what logic demanded. But logic had never been Bumpy Johnson's battlefield. What truly frightened those listening was not that the rival feared death. Everyone in that world accepted death as a cost of doing business. What unsettled them was why he feared Bumpy more than the grave. That question lingered longer than any rumor, because the answer was not a story about violence. It was a story about erosion. Bumpy's reputation had matured beyond brutality. By this point, his name carried a psychological weight that distorted decision-making. Men didn't ask, "Can I survive him?" They asked, "What will be left of me if I do?" That shift mattered. Survival without power was not survival at all. It was exposure. The rival had understood this too late. In his confession, he described how confidence became a liability. Every attempt to project strength felt like a lie that could be exposed at any moment. Every loyal ally suddenly looked like a potential informant. Every plan seemed compromised before it even formed. The pressure did not come from Bumpy's presence, but from his absence. Silence was the mechanism. This was how Bumpy turned courage into terror. He allowed men to imagine the worst version of themselves, then waited while they tried to outrun it. And the more they ran, the more obvious their fear became to everyone watching. Power thrives on stability. Once instability appears, others smell opportunity. The rival's circle began to shift. Not dramatically, not openly, just enough. A delayed response here, a neutral tone there. These were not betrayals yet, they were tests. And each test confirmed the same thing. The rival was no longer untouchable. That realization hollowed him out. He had built his identity on being decisive, respected, feared in his own right. Now, that identity was dissolving under the shadow of a man who hadn't spoken his name publicly once. The imbalance was humiliating. And humiliation spreads faster than fear. The confession revealed something even darker. The rival began to imagine Bumpy letting him live, not out of mercy, but out of design. Living as an example, living long enough for everyone to see what happens to men who challenge the wrong kind of power. That possibility haunted him more than any execution scenario he could imagine. Because death ended stories, survival extended them. Bumpy understood narrative better than anyone. He knew how legends formed. He knew how fear multiplied when it was seen, not just heard. If the rival survived in a diminished state, stripped of influence and respect, it would send a louder message than any public killing ever could. And the rival knew it too. Sleep abandoned him. Meals tasted like obligation. Time stretched painfully. Each day without resolution felt intentional, as if Bumpy were allowing the pressure to build until it crushed him from the inside. That waiting was not passive. It was an act of dominance. The underworld noticed. Meetings became shorter. conversations more careful. Men measured their words when Bumpy's name entered a room. Even those who had no direct conflict with him felt the shift. If one rival could be reduced to begging for death without confrontation, then no one was immune. This was the moment Bumpy's reputation crossed a line. He was no longer a threat to individuals. He was a destabilizing force to the entire system. He didn't just remove obstacles. He changed how people thought about conflict itself. The rival's confession ended with a chilling admission. The fear was no longer external. It lived inside him. He carried it everywhere, even alone, even safe, even guarded. That internalization meant Bumpy had already won. Control had transferred without a single order being given. When word spread that the rival preferred execution to prolonged exposure under Bumpy's shadow, it rewrote the rules. Men realized that violence was not the highest form of power anymore. Psychological dominance was, and Bumpy had mastered it. What terrified everyone most was the implication. If Bumpy chose patience over action, it was not because he hesitated. It was because he understood timing. He knew exactly when fear would peak, when resistance would collapse, and when surrender would feel like relief. By the time the rival's breakdown became undeniable, the damage had extended far beyond him. Alliances recalculated, enemies reconsidered. Neutral parties leaned away from conflict altogether. Bumpy did not need to issue commands. His reputation did the work for him, and this was the true consequence of the confession. It wasn't an admission of weakness. It was evidence of a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on bullets or bloodshed to dominate, one that made death feel like an escape. By the end of this phase, one truth had settled deep into the underworld's consciousness. Facing Bumpy Johnson meant losing control of your own fate, and what followed would prove just how deliberate that loss was. The moment that broke him did not come with a threat. It did not come with a warning. It came with understanding. The rival crime figure had spent his life believing that survival was victory, outlasting enemies, escaping traps, living to fight another day. That belief had carried him through decades of violence and betrayal. But under Bumpy's shadow, that belief collapsed. Survival stopped feeling like winning. It started feeling like a sentence. This was the emotional turning point. The instant he understood that staying alive was no longer mercy, it was strategy. He began to see his future clearly, and that clarity was unbearable. A future where he woke up every day waiting for the next loss, the next humiliation, the next quiet signal that his power was draining away. No dramatic end, no final stand, just a slow shrinking of influence until his name meant nothing. In his confession, he admitted that this realization hit harder than any gunshot ever could. Guns ended pain quickly. This promised something worse: awareness. Bumpy's genius was never cruelty for its own sake. It was precision. He understood that fear works best when it leaves room for imagination. The rival imagined meetings where he would no longer be listened to, imagined partners who would smile politely and then ignore him, imagined younger men circling, sensing weakness, waiting for the moment to replace him. That imagination became torture. The emotional weight of that future crushed him. He wasn't afraid of dying young. He was afraid of living long enough to watch himself become irrelevant. Power had been his identity. Without it, he didn't know who he was. And Bumpy knew that too. This was where psychological warfare reached its peak. No violence, no confrontation, just time. Every day without resolution confirmed the same message. Bumpy was in control, and he was choosing not to end it yet. That choice stripped the rival of dignity. It told him he wasn't even worth immediate action. He was being studied, measured, reduced. The emotional toll was devastating. He became isolated, not because people abandoned him openly, but because connection felt dangerous, talking felt risky, trust felt foolish. He was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. That loneliness amplified the fear until it felt physical. He began to envy men who had died quickly, men whose stories ended cleanly, men who never had to watch themselves fade. That envy scared him more than anything else. It told him his instincts had reversed. Life was no longer the goal. Escape was. This is when begging for death stopped sounding insane and started sounding logical. In his own words, death represented certainty, an end point, a moment where fear stopped expanding. Living under Bumpy's shadow had no end point. It was open-ended suffering, a slow erasure of everything he had built. The most emotional part of the confession was not the fear, it was the shame. Shame that he had been reduced to this state without a single punch thrown. Shame that his empire, once built on intimidation, was now dissolving because someone else understood fear better than he ever had. He realized that Bumpy had already won the war without firing a shot. The begging was not defeat, it was acknowledgement. When intermediaries carried his plea that he would rather die than endure what was coming, it shocked everyone who heard it. But for the rival, it felt like honesty for the first time in weeks. He was no longer pretending to be strong. He was naming the truth. And that truth echoed through Harlem and beyond. If a man like him could reach this point, then power itself had changed. Strength was no longer measured by how much violence you could unleash. It was measured by how deeply you could invade someone's mind and rearrange their sense of reality. This realization marked a turning point not just for one man, but for the entire criminal world watching from the shadows. They understood now that Bumpy didn't need to destroy bodies to win. He destroyed futures. And once a future was destroyed, the body didn't matter anymore. What came next would prove that this emotional collapse was not an accident, it was the design. Confessions in the underworld rarely come from guilt. They come from exhaustion. And this one did not surface in a courtroom or under police pressure. It surfaced in private, behind closed doors, passed carefully through intermediaries who understood the danger of carrying such words. When the rival finally spoke, it wasn't to save himself. It was to explain how he had already lost. The confession was calm. That was the most disturbing part. He did not rant. He did not exaggerate. He simply described the sequence of events that led him to one conclusion. Bumpy Johnson had taken control of his fate long before he realized it. Not through violence, but through reputation, through patience, through allowing fear to mature on its own. What shook the underworld was not the content alone, but the clarity. Powerful men are expected to rationalize their downfall. Blame bad luck, blame betrayal, blame circumstances. He did none of that. He took responsibility for one thing, only underestimating the kind of power Bumpy represented. He explained how every move he made to protect himself only tightened the trap. Increased security made him look afraid. Changing routines made him predictable. Reaching out to allies exposed how much reassurance he needed. Each defensive action sent a signal, and Bumpy didn't need to intercept messages to read them. Fear broadcasts itself. The confession revealed something deeply unsettling. Bumpy never had to directly threaten him. Others did it for him, unknowingly. The rival described how people would mention Bumpy casually, almost accidentally, in conversation. A pause would follow. A look, a subtle shift in tone. Those moments carried more weight than explicit warnings ever could. That was when he understood the depth of Bumpy's reach. The fear was not centralized, it was distributed. It lived in the reactions of others, in their caution, in their silence. The underworld depended on shared assumptions, rules everyone pretended were stable. This confession shattered those assumptions. It showed that power could operate invisibly, without confrontation, without spectacle. That terrified men who had built their identities on visible dominance. The rival admitted that his biggest mistake was believing that time would weaken the threat. Instead, time strengthened it. Every day, Bumpy did nothing reinforce the idea that something worse was coming. That anticipation hollowed him out. He began to dread not an attack, but a message. Not violence, but confirmation. By the time he confessed, he no longer believed escape was possible. Even if he fled the city, the reputation would follow. Fear travels faster than people, and reputations like Bumpy's do not respect borders. This realization broke something fundamental. The rival no longer trusted geography, money, or numbers. None of it mattered against a man whose influence reshaped perception itself. That was the core of the confession. Bumpy had altered the way he saw the world. When fragments of this confession reached other power figures, reactions varied. Some dismissed it publicly, but changed behavior privately. Some grew more cautious. Some backed away from conflicts they had been planning. The smart ones listened. Because the confession wasn't just a personal admission. It was a warning. It warned that intimidation no longer required presence, that dominance could be exercised through absence, that the most dangerous man in the room might be the one who never entered it. For many, this was deeply destabilizing. The underworld thrived on predictable hierarchies, on knowing who to fear and when. Bumpy disrupted that clarity. He introduced uncertainty as a weapon, and uncertainty corrodes confidence faster than bullets ever could. The rival's final admission was the most haunting. He said that by the time he begged for death, he was no longer afraid of Bumpy himself. He was afraid of what Bumpy had revealed about him, that his strength had always been conditional, that without constant reinforcement, it collapsed. That insight rippled outward. Men began questioning their own foundations, their own reputations, their own resilience under psychological pressure. And once doubt enters, power begins to slip. The confession marked a line in history. Before it, violence was the ultimate threat. After it, fear itself became the currency of control. Bumpy Johnson did not just defeat a rival, he redefined dominance. And the underworld would never feel solid again after that. By the time the plea was finally delivered, it no longer sounded desperate. It sounded exhausted. The rival was not asking to be spared. He was asking for an ending, not because he had lost the will to live, but because living under Bumpy Johnson's design had stripped life of its meaning. This was the emotional truth at the heart of the confession, and the part that shook even the hardest men who heard it. The request for death was not about fear of pain. It was about fear of becoming something unrecognizable. The rival understood what Bumpy intended better than anyone else ever had. Bumpy was not going to rush. He was not going to make a public spectacle. He was going to let time do the work. Let doubt spread. Let loyalty thin. Let respect rot quietly from the inside. The rival saw the path clearly, and that clarity destroyed him. Because the path did not end with a bullet. It ended with survival without identity. He imagined himself alive months later, still breathing, still moving, but no longer feared. Men would nod politely, and then make decisions without him. His name would still be known, but only as a warning. He would exist as proof of what happens when you cross the wrong man and are left alive to remember it. That image broke him. In his confession, he described a moment of unbearable realization. The fear was no longer coming from Bumpy. It was coming from the mirror. He no longer recognized the man looking back. Power had shaped his entire sense of self. Without it, he felt hollow, small, exposed. This was the final victory of Bumpy's psychological war. He did not just threaten the rival's life. He threatened his humanity. The rival was being reduced to a lesson, an object, a living symbol. Death, in contrast, felt personal. It felt final. It felt like the last choice he could still make for himself. That is why he begged. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly, through channels that understood the weight of such words. He asked for death not as mercy, but as dignity, as a way to end the story before it erased him completely. Those who heard the request were stunned, not because of its content, but because of its logic. Once they understood it, they felt the fear themselves. If Bumpy could push a powerful man to this conclusion without touching him, then no amount of guards, money, or territory could guarantee safety anymore. This was the moment Bumpy Johnson's legend hardened into something permanent. Men began to understand that Bumpy did not seek chaos. He sought control, and control did not require bloodshed if fear could do the job more efficiently. Killing ended problems. Letting them live under pressure solved them more thoroughly. The rival's confession ended with a sentence that spread quietly through Harlem and beyond. He said that death would end his suffering, but facing Bumpy would extend it forever. That sentence alone carried more power than any violent act could have. It forced everyone listening to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most terrifying punishment is not pain. It is awareness. Awareness of loss. Awareness of decline. Awareness that you are being watched fade. Bumpy understood this at an instinctive level. He never rushed toward revenge. He let it arrive on its own schedule. He understood that fear grows strongest when it is allowed to breathe, when it has time to imagine. when it fills the gaps left by silence. In the end, whether Bumpy granted the request or not mattered less than the fact that it was made. The request itself was the victory. It proved that Bumpy's reputation had crossed a threshold no one else had reached. He had become a force that reshaped choices. The underworld adjusted accordingly. Conflicts softened. Lines were not crossed. Men reconsidered alliances and ambitions, not because Bumpy demanded it, but because they understood the cost of ignoring him. This was the lasting impact of the confession. It did not end with one man's collapse. It rewrote the rules of fear. It taught everyone watching that survival is not always the prize it seems to be. Sometimes, survival is the punishment, and Bumpy Johnson was the man who made powerful men understand that truth before it was too late.